Alright, here we are, looking at the sixth Dialogue of Socrates, the final in our introductory little paperback. Looking at Phaedo today. What were your guys' first impressions?
This one was really long, first impression, and kind of convoluted. I found like Socrates trying to prove that souls are immortal and that there's life after death. And I didn't really get into it as much as the other ones. Like he was really going off. It was a very dense writing, and he was trying to make these arguments that from his worldly experience, he's trying to prove the existence of post-worldly experience. And I just feel as though he didn't have any grounds to really prove or disprove his arguments with.
Yeah, and he makes a really good metaphor of the numbers, like odd being opposite to even, and life being opposite to death. And he makes the point that numbers progress in the same kind of cycle as souls do. And the only thing you would really have to say to dispute that is they don't have the same nature. So the argument's kind of silly. And he spends a lot of time just making that comparison. It doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, it's very dense. And plus, he kind of goes back to what he originally talked about, which was the body and how the default setting is to just go after pleasure rather than just go after knowledge. And it's been repeated previously from the previous dialogues. And I kind of didn't expect him to talk much about, post-worldly events that happen after, especially when it comes to meeting meeting other gods, if that were possible. I didn't expect him to make an argument for that.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Kind of like you kind of see that as the turtles all the way down fallacy, almost. You say, well, if if we have gods in this world, then they must obviously have gods in the next world. So he's just seeing the world where you keep dying and living and dying and living over and over again. But he also includes the possibility of an afterlife. So he kind of contradicts himself a little bit there.
Yeah, and the fact that you go towards death, it's kind of like a new beginning for you.
It really seemed like the musings of a dying man who was really hopeful that there was life after death, and that he had to prove this belief that the soul persists in order to remain so calm, that all of his life's actions got him to this place, and that this was the will of the universe and the everlasting, and that this was his final argument, was that there was a point to his existence because life doesn't stop at death. And he goes around and does the cyclical arguments, and it was just like he was trying very hard, to convince not his friends but himself that there was a point to it all.
I think that's really the essence of this dialogue, not in the arguments themselves, but just in human nature of, Socrates himself and all of his students there, how much they truly wanted to believe that there was an afterlife, and how much they needed to believe that there was an afterlife to not lose their minds at Socrates being executed before their eyes.
Yeah.
Something that he brings up is a true philosopher should always be ready to die, but never take their own life, because that's in a way robbing the gods or robbing your master of their own property. And he makes it as a comparison of, how would you feel if your donkey just up and killed himself? You wouldn't appreciate that too much now, would you? So don't do it yourself.
I did find that passage pretty interesting. I liked his point of being in the service of gods, and if there is a purpose to life, then killing yourself would be robbing destiny of your purpose. And I really liked that. That was very poetic.
Yeah.
Whether it's true or not, that's completely another story, but it was nice verse.
Yeah. It's a good way to think and act, not necessarily believe. the wording of that can get kind of messy once you get into it, but
Yeah, I don't know. I really forced myself through this one. It wasn't as enjoyable. It was very dense and there was a lot going on. And I think that in retrospect, I ought to have read it a few more times and really kind of studied it. I feel like you could do an entire like 4-week course just studying Phaedo, because there's, I think, 4 arguments that he puts forth to prove that the soul persists, and he's really dense with this explanation. And like just like we mentioned, the numbers, like he went around for probably 5 or 6 pages trying to prove that an odd number isn't an even number, to make the point that life is created by the soul, not life is the soul, and as such the soul isn't dead because life can never be dead. But it really didn't make sense, and it didn't hold water, like we were saying before we started recording. It was just odd. And I think if I gave it more time and more respect and really studied the Socratic dialogue and the logical fallacies and infallacies that he puts forward, maybe I would have a better appreciation for it.
mm-hmm. And there's a couple of different arguments that he's trying to dispute with the whole odd and even metaphor. Because one of the students says that the soul is kind of like a man who wears a certain coat and then the coat wears out and then he has to get a new coat, so the soul has to get a new body. But eventually the body itself is going to wear out, and it doesn't matter how many coats they wear. The soul will always eventually wither and die. And another of the students makes a similar argument of the soul is a melody and the body is an instrument, and when the instrument breaks, then there's nothing left to produce the soul.
I liked that one actually, because he talks about the harmony of the body and soul, and he relates it to fire, if I'm not incorrect in saying, and that while the fire can go out, that doesn't stop the existence of fire, and that fire can be sparked again later. And the whole notion that the soul exists even though we're not experiencing at all times. Like when someone dies, the soul leaves them, but that doesn't mean that the soul is gone. Just as your fire can burn out, that doesn't mean you can't have fire again. But to argue that a new fire is equal to a dead fire and is the same fire seems completely illogical.
Yeah, when I was thinking about the instrument metaphor, it kind of just came into my head like, well, it's less the sound and more the symphony, let's say. Like the actual written orchestration of music. Like if the soul is Stairway to Heaven, it can be played on plenty of guitars at once, right?
Yeah.
So your soul can pass through, or ideas can pass through the minds of plenty of people, or plenty of bodies.
Which is interesting, because like he's obviously talking about reincarnation of the soul, and as he gets into his explanation of the afterlife, you kind of see how a soul gets to pass the trials of death to regain life. And it's an interesting belief. It's an interesting concept. And again, I think my fundamental issue with the argument that the soul persists is that we have no grounds for knowing, and that he's using mortal constructs to prove an immortal thing. But there's no immortal thing or immortal logic on this plane of existence that he could use to rationalize as a proof. There is no proof.
Yeah,
And
it's like trying to measure a volume of water with a ruler in centimeters. Like it's not going to work. We don't have the proper tools to examine all these heavenly things with our earthly limitations.
Exactly. It's just not the perspective. And he talks about, in the end, the fish bringing its head out of water and witnessing this world greater than itself, and that if humans could get to the upper reaches of Earth, that we'd witness an extraordinary world filled with gods, but that we're not capable of doing it. And it's like, okay, but that's the whole point, is that we don't know, and we're not capable of getting to a place where we know. And so this grasping at straws of saying 1 doesn't equal 2 therefore, when I die, my soul exists forever, seems really off base.
Yeah. And he says it himself that, please forgive me for my biased arguments, because he knows that he can't go forth without his bias of saying there's a soul, because he needs to believe that there's a soul. And everyone else in the room kind of just gives into that by succumbing to the exact same feelings that they believe that they need there to be a soul, rather than just pursuing the knowledge of is there a soul or is there not a soul, or does it carry on after death. They're just trying to find a reason to say that there is a soul that carries on after death.
It's odd because they do try to argue with him, right? Like, he does ask them to undermine and disprove his points, and yet for some reason when they do make that attempt, he goes on and he rambles and rants and raves about their points and gets to a place where he has proved to them that there is perchance a soul, and it just doesn't feel genuine. Like, it was very bizarre. I'm wondering what it would be like in its original language reading it, but
It kind
I
of
don't
goes
know.
back to square one in a way.
Yeah. I mean, whether he's right or wrong, let's put that at the wayside for now. The book, the dialogue was heavily intense, and I mean, it pushed my brain to the points of really having to be scrunched and reread paragraphs. Like, it was good writing. It was intense writing.
It's very emotional as well.
Yeah.
Like right before Socrates takes the poison, everyone else in the room starts crying and screaming, and he says, "Hey, didn't I just say that a man should die in peace? I just sent
Isn't
out
this
the
why
women
I
and
sent away
children."
the women?
Yeah. And then they're all ashamed, and they quiet down. And
I did, and I liked how kind the jailer was and how poignant the jailer was, that it wasn't his fault that he was giving him the poison, that it was just simply his task and not his decision, and that he respected him and was disappointed to have to do this, and that Socrates was the first prisoner that he was able to give his death sentence to without having to deal with anger and lashings out of personality, because Socrates was this wise philosopher man who accepted his sentence with grace, and his musings on his deathbed were just in character for him. I mean, being in that position as the person he was, I don't know what else he could have discussed.
yeah, and you see he never really wavers from that calm demeanor. And his very last words are, "I owe the gods an extra rooster. Make sure you pay that debt for me." And he says, "Yep, I'll do it. I'll take care of it. Don't you worry about that, Socrates. Is there anything else?" And there's no reply, because he'd already passed on. Just died in complete peace around his students and friends. But oddly enough, there was one person who wasn't there. The author of all of these dialogues that we've been reading, Plato himself, elected not to be present at the execution of Socrates.
Well, he was sick, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's what it says.
It makes you wonder just how much of it, like, because that's the thing with a couple of these dialogues where it's like, oh, actually, it's not a first-hand account. It's someone recounting all of the conversation. And then it's like you have 60 pages of intense Socratic dialogue being retold by an individual. And I mean, I've got a good memory, but not to the degree that I could recite an entire 4-hour argument conversation between 8 parties.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable. But I think it's just in like the practice of it, because we spend all of our time, writing and watching things and taking in hours and hours of content. These guys just kind of mulled over the same speeches over and over again. And it obviously has to be admitted that some of it's forgotten and left out, and then a little bit more added when it was written and rewritten and translated. But still, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. It's certainly several degrees of separation from the first-hand account. It's a shame they didn't have voice recorders back then. Wouldn't that be something, eh? A live studio podcast at Socrates' deathbed.
Man, imagine if that footage was still around today, what we could do with it.
Yeah.
Think about it in the future, like 2,000 years from now, when they're watching old podcasts from this era. Think about what that's going to be like if we make it that far.
It's going to be different. It's going to be very different. Like all of the interviews that are now so easily available. It's no longer hearsay. It's firsthand accounts. Instead, like 2,000 years ago, someone wrote a book and we founded an entire belief system on that book. But in 2,000 years, people will be able to look back and say, this is exactly what that person said. Here is him saying it.
So how do you feel about what the Greeks think about the soul being the source of good and the body being the source of like bad and distraction? About pain and pleasure bolts together the body and soul.
I think it was an interesting comparison. The body obviously manifests the ego, and the soul, this higher self that may or may not truly exist, that when people talk about self-actualization and attunement with their self and becoming centered, that they numb the drive of the ego to satisfy cravings and more base pleasures and are able to actually work in compatibility with their closest humans. That's a terrible sentence.
Yeah, like kind of living in accordance with the rest of humanity,
as opposed to just taking advantage and running around doing what pleases in the moment. I think the soul is this factor that knows, and I think everyone knows what they're doing wrong. Like if you ask them, what is it that you need to change about yourself, they wouldn't say, oh, I don't know. Like they know, they just haven't gotten to the place where they do. And I think the soul is that place that when you're in tune with it and you're able to act in accordance with your own inner purpose, that you can overcome instantaneous gratification and work to build a brighter future for yourself, your family, your community, and in effect, the world. I think the Greeks were onto something there.
Yeah, they really put forth the virtue of detachment. You have to take a minute every once in a while to just observe the soul and realize that you're not just the body. You're not just performing the duties and actions of the body. There's a soul in there that you have to be in attune with as well. And they talk a lot about the cardinal virtues in this book too, of justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance again.
I think those are very good virtues. I think they nailed those down quite well, and that those should be more discussed in mainstream media and every opportunity that we get. Like I think, like I said, that a lot of these points should really be discussed early on with humans as we're training them to be adults. You know, little kids in schools should be witness to this sort of level of understanding of what it means to be happy right now and to be happy forever and to not have regrets and to be temperate and to be courageous.
Yes, for sure.
How we go about doing that, I'm not so sure. But I do think that it is a good lesson. And I think there's lots of good lessons in these old Greek writings about what it means to be alive and to do the best with what you have. And I think that if you have to argue that your soul exists on the other side of death, on your deathbed, to prove to yourself and to your friends that your whole life had meaning, that isn't the worst possible thing that could happen. And in fact, it might even be somewhere on the mean closer to a good thing to prove than a bad thing.
Yeah. The way I see it, you're in this world right now, and that's the world you should be focusing on. If you make it to another one down the road, then you have a new set of tools to deal with it when you reach it. So don't worry about it now.
Well, I'd argue further that the belief that if you do wrong in this world, you will be thrown into the river of lava and mud and forced to suffer for a year before you can ask those who you've done wrong forgiveness. And if they do not forgive you, that you're thrown back into the river and you're perpetuating torture until you're forgiven, it is a really interesting metaphor that's discussed very briefly at the end of this dialogue. And I think that we do, even on this plane, experience that we suffer perpetually until we've righted our wrongs and sought forgiveness from those parties we've done injustice to, and to believe that there's nothing afterwards, there's no retribution or punishment or reward for living a good or bad life, can lead to bad men and evil people. Because if there's nothing else afterwards and this is all there is, many people can very easily lean on the crutch of satisfying their basic needs and doing ridiculous, unjust, untemperate acts throughout their whole life.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that Alexander Solzhenitsyn line. The line between good and evil cuts between the heart of every man or woman or every human. Something like that.
I'm not familiar, but that is a good one.
It's one that Jordan Peterson brings up a lot.
Funny, I haven't heard it yet. I just watched an interview with him yesterday that came up just a few days ago. It was quite good, talking about his religious belief and the notion that you'd have to have a great audacity to say you believe in God, because to believe in God truly is to act in a way that is deserving of his existence, and that there are very, very few people on this planet that deserve to be able to say they believe in God, because they're not living it. They aren't living a life that reflects a belief in God. They have this desire of God, but they don't live the virtues. They don't practice good faith in their life, in every aspect of their life. And he says, God only knows how great you would be if you truly did believe in him.
Yeah, I think I watched the same one. That's the PragerU video you're talking about?
Yeah, it was great. That's how I started my day yesterday. Any other final points either of you want to bring up about Phaedo?
Not really. I mean, this is just kind of a really dense book, and it kind of goes full circle. That's what I got out of it. So I don't have anything else.
I'm sad that it's over. This has been a really good run. This Dialogue of Socrates podcast series has been really interesting. It's opened my eyes to a lot of ideas that I was unfamiliar with, or maybe had a notion about. And I don't know if you guys are up for it, but I'd love to review some of the key points from all of the dialogues in one final closing video, just because I have a hard time saying goodbye.
Yeah, we can do that.
It does feel nice to have closed the book, having read every page and consumed every thought, and knowing that I have finished another book this month. I think that's 3 or 4 books I finished this month. So that was very good. Definitely room for improvement.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys want to talk about the 4 rivers metaphor at the very end?
I don't know how much there is to say about it. It was very weird. And again, that's something I'd need to write down and really look at. I liked the notion of it, and I touched on the suffering-based river. But honestly, I'll listen. I don't know how much I have to contribute. Go wild, Scott.
Well, Socrates makes an argument at the end that all the waters of the world carry the souls from the living world down to the world below. It has a lot of similarities, but it differs quite a bit from the myth of from the end of the Republic. It has a few similarities in the way that it takes the souls there and then they forget, and then it brings them back to the other world or to another afterlife. That's another thing I'd like to talk about, actually. Like, what do you think is the difference between the people that get recycled back into the world and the people that go on to the other afterlife? Because he seems to present a world where both are possible.
It was an interesting one, wasn't it? The whole metaphor of the rivers, like one river leads you to reincarnation in an animal, and another leads you to the temples of the gods, and another leads you to the suffering and seeking forgiveness from those you've wronged, and then another allows you to live life again. And it's very odd. And I think if you ask me again in 150 podcasts from now, I will have much more to say about it, because I'm sure that we'll read about Indian religions and Eastern philosophies and those sorts of things, because I'd love to make some comparisons between this concept that he has of the afterlife, but I'm not read enough on spirituality, philosophy, reincarnation, whatever subject matter best appropriately describes this notion that there are multiple layers to reincarnation and afterlife, that maybe you suffer, maybe you're reborn in a lesser form, maybe you ascend to a higher plane of existence and perfection, and perhaps you get to go it again and make yourself a better man another time to cross that bridge again and end up in the highest levels, the highest plateaus of this afterlife. But I don't even know if that's the point, if the point is to be with the gods in their temples, or if the point is to be on the planet again making an impact.
Yeah, it's really kind of, I don't know, it's mysterious. And it's different from the story of because when goes on his journey briefly to the afterlife, he sees that all the souls that get taken into the underworld pick up a new mantle and then get rebirthed into the world after drinking from the river that makes them forget. So the souls take on a cycle of the tyrants, take on the souls of the simpletons, and the simpletons take on the souls of the tyrants, and so on and so forth. So people keep changing and the world keeps changing into this cycle of democracy and authoritarianism. So that's what it kind of gets at the Republic, but it's more of a spiritual journey in Phaedo.
Yeah. I'm going to have to say I'll need to read the Republic, but I don't know. I want to go back and reread just the Phaedo metaphor of the afterlife rivers, because it was really good. Like I keep saying, I wish I had dedicated more time to actually studying this dialogue, because there was so much to unpack. And I think reading it through, I missed a lot of the more subtler arguments, and you can get lost in the way Socrates talks, right? Like he goes off so quickly, and within a couple pages he's merged together 15 points and you've only grasped 4 of them.
And there's a metaphor of similar to the odd and even metaphor where he says, if you go to sleep and then you wake up all the time, why wouldn't you expect to come back alive after you dying?
The cyclical argument that life is to death as death is to life, as sleep is to waking and waking is to sleeping, because you can't have one without the other. I found that one to be pretty funny too, because again, that's this mortal construct of, well, I can't be awake if I wasn't asleep. And it's like, you've taken that construct of, in order to be awake, you have to have been asleep at some point. And
yeah, and it turns into a chicken or the egg conversation. Like
yeah,
you have to start out in one of those modes, so it obviously doesn't hold water.
No, not at all. And then the other argument that he had, that we knew of certain ideas of divine beauty and logic and reason, and we forgot them when we came into this world, kind of leads into your talking about the forgetting in the Republic, that we had been exposed to these higher ideas, but that we don't need to be taught them, we need to remember them. And when we look at a perfect thing, or an imperfect thing rather, we can infer that there is a perfect way for that thing to be, and that because we have the notion that something imperfect could be perfect, it's just a remembrance of divinity that came before our life on this world, because we were in a place where things were perfect. And that was just so up there. What did you think of that one?
Yeah, I see almost like an evolution in like the Greco-Roman timeline, because you see, like in Socrates' time, they established that all learning is remembering, but you get further down the line and it turns into more of a, all learning is just kind of an extraction from the divinity of intelligence, that you're not necessarily remembering something that you yourself have learned in a past life. You're just extracting from the greater intelligence that is the universe, that everyone who is existing in the universe draws upon.
Yeah, instead of remembering, you're acquainting yourself with the truth.
Yes.
Well, like I said, in 150 podcasts from now, I will have much more to say about this book.
Yes, absolutely.
For now, though, in fear of becoming like the Socratic cyclical argument, I would say that I have exhausted my ability to comment on this rather intense and good read of Phaedo.
And I would agree with that. I think we need to get some more literature under our belt, take another stab at some more of Plato, maybe take a look at some Aristotle, some other Greeks, some Stoics.
I'm sure we'll digest it all. In what order becomes the question.
We'll figure it out from here. But until next time, thanks for tuning in.
See you later.
May the Force be with you.
May the force be equal to mass times acceleration.